Okay, so let us move on to more useful things. Mechanical arithmetic. Can we make machines which will do arithmetic for us? So, Pascal of course, you are familiar with as students of science in various places. Pascal's name has appeared, not least as a programming language, name of a programming language. So, he invented a mechanical calculator using something called lantern gears, which we will not go into, and he tried out 50 different prototypes before presenting his machine in 1645 to the public. It was called Pascaline or arithmetic machine or Pascal's calculator, and it could add and subtract two numbers, that was its limits of its mental abilities, and multiply and divide by repetition essentially. There is a image of a Pascaline from one of the museums, and he received the rights to produce this machine and sell it in France, but it was not something which was commercially viable for him essentially. So, as this article says, the cost and complexity of producing the Pascaline was too much for him essentially, and production ceased in a year. But this is a real machine which could add, subtract and multiply two numbers. So, you can see we are already looking at the advent of calculating machines. So, all these are famous names, you must have encountered them. For example, Leibniz we know as an inventor of the calculus. So, these were sort of multifaceted people, they did all kinds of things in those days. So, he was a German philosopher and mathematician. He started to work on his own calculator after Pascal's death. So, he invented something which is called as a Leibniz wheel or a stepped drum, which could do counting in some sense. So, here is an image from the Wikipedia site. So, you can see there is a gear in the red color fixed to a rod, and depending upon, and there is a stepped set of teeth in the orange cylinder. So, depending upon where the gear is, it would be rotated some number of times dependent upon how many of those teeth it encountered essentially. So, if it was on the lower part, it would count 0 or 1. If it was raised to the extreme right, then it would be struck by, let us say 9 or 10 teeth, and it would count up 10. So, it is a small counting device that he invented. So, all these machines in those times were mechanical in nature. It is called the step drum, and as you can see from this quote, it was used for 3 centuries until the advent of the electronic calculator, which came only much later in life, in fact in the last century. And he built this machine called the stepped reckoner. So, the stepped reckoner, the stepped name comes from the kind of drum it uses, the stepped drum. It was a digital mechanical calculator invented by Leibniz around 1672 and completed in 1694. It could perform multiplication by repeated addition and division by repeated subtraction, and it could operate with 8 digit numbers. So, if you multiply two 8 digit numbers, it would give you a 16 digit answer. So, that was its precision, so to speak. Here is an image of the step reckoner from one of the museums essentially. Okay, so, Leibniz of course, was, as I said, a multifaceted person. He believed that much of human reasoning could be reduced to calculations of a sort. Okay, so, we are moving towards AI in some sense, that can we have machines, automaton which think and which can do reasoning, and including things like arithmetic. But he is going beyond arithmetic. He is saying that human reasoning could be reduced to calculations of a sort, and such calculations could resolve many differences of opinion essentially. So, here is a quote from Leibniz. He says, the only way to rectify our reasonings, and mind this language is not modern language, it is a slightly old language. The only way to rectify our reasonings is to make them as tangible as those of the mathematicians, so that we can find our error at a glance. And when there is a dispute among persons, we can simply say, let us calculate without further ado to see who is right essentially. The motivation behind devising logic is the same essentially, and we will see that logic also evolved from similar background. But this idea that arguments can be settled by calculation. So, you do not have to fight or something like that, also goes back to those times essentially. Of course, if you tell this to the UP government, they would not believe it. So, these are the general principles of his logic and in fact, his whole philosophy, and they are that all our ideas are compounded from a very small number of simple ideas, which form the alphabet of human thought essentially. Okay. So, a very significant step he is making essentially. He is saying that everything that we think about is essentially combinations of some small set of simple things. Remember, in those days physics or science had still not discovered the notion of an atom. All those ideas came much later essentially, and Leibniz is talking about the fact that there are small number of simple ideas which combine and form complex ideas to form new ideas essentially. And this is an idea which sort of carries forward to present day knowledge representation as well. There have been approaches to knowledge representation which says that we will work with a small number of primitive concepts and derive all other concepts from those concepts essentially. So, it is a very significant idea. So, the alphabet of human thought, and secondly, complex ideas proceed from these simple ideas by a uniform and symmetrical combination analogous to arithmetic multiplication. So, what he means by uniform and symmetric combination is that there is a well defined way of doing things essentially, the well defined mechanical way of, just like you have algorithms for adding or doing long division or multiplication, you have algorithms for combining smaller ideas into more complex ones essentially. So, there are two things he is saying. One is that everything, all ideas are made up of a finite set of simple ideas, and then there is a uniform way of combining ideas to form more complex ideas essentially. And remember, this was in the 17th century. The first commercial success of a mechanical calculator was in 1820. Thomas de Colmar from France, he built this machine and it was strong and sturdy enough to withstand daily use in the office environment essentially. So, if you look at the last paragraph, so these are some of the images which are of this real machines, and as you can see in the second paragraph, they were manufactured from 1851 to 1915. So, not even 100 years ago you might have found people using such a machine to do arithmetic essentially. The last paragraph says that its sturdy design made it a key player in the move from human computers to calculating machines that took place during the second half of the 19th century. So, I want to draw your attention to the phrase human computers. Before our computers, digital computers or mechanical computers that we will see in a moment were invented, the word computation was essentially applied to human beings. The human beings computed things and they were called computers essentially, and this is a term that we will see again later sometime. That brings us to the first computer. So, you are all familiar with Charles Babbage, I presume, 18th century. He was a mathematician, philosopher, inventor, mechanical engineer, best remembered for his idea of the programmable computer. All the machines that we have seen so far were not programmable, they could do arithmetic for example, and that was about it essentially. Charles Babbage took this to the next step. So, he as a child was fascinated by the same automaton, the kind of talking heads, moving figures that we talked about, and this is a quote from what he said about some statues that he saw displayed by a man called Merlin, and he described them as saying there are these two feminine figures. He says one walked, used an eyeglass occasionally and bowed frequently, her motions were singularly graceful, and he says the other was a dancer full of imagination. I do not know how he got that, and irresistible essentially. So, this was the general fascination with talking, moving figures that was pushing all these ideas forward essentially. So, in 1822 he began building what is called as a difference engine. You must have heard the term. It was designed to compute polynomial functions more than addition and multiplication. The first engine was composed of 25,000 parts, weighed about 13,600 kilograms and was 8 feet tall. Here is an image of a difference engine. On the bottom you can see, on the bottom left you can see an image which is there in the London Science Museum, and on its right is a small enlargement of the gear systems that it was using, and on the top is a part of a difference engine assembled after his death by his son, using parts found in his lab essentially. So, that is the original Babbage engine, whereas what here is a recreation, modern recreation of the difference engine that you can see, but these are working machines. One place where Babbage got some ideas was from these so called Jacquard looms essentially. So, why is a computer a different machine from the rest of the machines? Because it is programmable. And how is it programmable? Because we have this idea of a stored program. We can plug in a program and run that program, then we can plug in a different program and run the different program. So, the stored program which can be input. The idea came from these Jacquard looms, which is the kind of punched cards that you see here on the left, which is an enlargement of the figure on the right, which were used to create designs in fabrics essentially. So, these looms were used to create these patterned fabrics, and the pattern could be controlled by these punched cards. So, this idea of punched cards is what Babbage took from there, and he created what is known as the analytic engine. It was a proposed, he did not actually build it, mechanical general purpose computer designed by Charles Babbage, first described in 1837. It had an arithmetic and logic unit, control flow, all modern terms in computer science in the form of conditional and branching loops and integrated memory, and it was the first machine which in the modern sense could be said to be Turing complete essentially, which means it is equivalent to a Turing machine. The first programmer was his accomplice or collaborator, Augusta Ada King. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, who was a poet. She is now known as Ada Lovelace, was an English mathematician and writer, chiefly known for the work that she did along with Babbage essentially. So, her notes include what can be called as the first algorithm, which is processed by a machine, and because of this she is often called as the first programmer, and the programming language Ada that you might have heard about, promoted by the US Department of Defense, is named after her essentially. So, she went beyond number crunching, again like Leibniz. She realized that the potential of the device extended far more beyond number crunching, and she wrote, and this is a quotation, that the analytic might act upon other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract signs of operations and so on. And then in particular she talks about generating music. She says that supposing that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds and the science of harmony and musical composition were susceptible of such expressions, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music to any degree of complexity essentially. So, even then Babbage was just designing this analytic engine, which was not even built, and she was imagining that such a machine could compose music essentially, because nowadays we know it can be done. And finally, in this study of mechanical history, we look at this first electronic machine which was built, called the ENIAC. You must be familiar with it, but you can just see the size of ENIAC, 17,000 vacuum tubes, 7,200 crystal diodes and so on and so forth. 27 tons, it occupied a full room essentially. It was not even as powerful as a small computer that you have on a smartphone nowadays, but that was the first electronic machine essentially. So, with that we come to the end of the first part, which is the mechanical side of this thing. So, we will take a small break and come back with the second question, which is this notion of mind and philosophy. How did the notion of mind come back in philosophy? So, we will stop for a while and then we will start in about 3 or 4 minutes essentially.